Okay, in this last video, we're going to finish up the remaining sections in Chapter 10. We're going to talk about a couple of more diverse and smaller, at least in terms of the number of pathogens in them, phyla. So we're going to start with these spirochetes, which are twisted cells. They have this spiral shape, and this is what gives them their name. Some of them are symbionts and some of them are pathogens. We have some important ones in here: Treponema pallidum, which causes syphilis, and Borrelia burgdorferi, Lyme disease there. This one is sexually transmitted. This one is tick-borne. These are very difficult to see under the microscope. That's why we haven't really seen them much in the lab. And this thin shape makes it really difficult. You have to go to 100x, and they don't stain super well sometimes. So sometimes the negative stain can be very good for these. This spiral shape leads to some interesting properties. They can actually propel themselves forward using their kind of corkscrew shaped, and this can help them get through thick and viscous fluids like things like mucus and stuff like that. So let's look at a case history on this one. We have Diane, a 20-year-old accountant from Utah, goes to the urgent clinic with a low-grade fever, malaise, which is just feeling bad, and a headache. She's sent home with a diagnosis of influenza, right? That is commonly what causes this. But she goes back 7 days later when this macular rash, which is small red flat spots on her torso, her arms, her hands, and her feet starts to show up. So this leads to more questions, right? Initially, they just go, okay, you probably had the flu. But now they're going to start asking some questions about what she's been doing. She notes that about a month ago, she had a painless ulcer on her vagina that healed spontaneously. So she had an ulcer, it went away, she thought it was gone. Unfortunately, this is very common of the disease syphilis. So serology, which is testing using antibodies, shows that she has contracted syphilis caused by the bacterium Treponema pallidum, subspecies pallidum. This will be important in a moment. It is sexually transmitted, and so she has to give a list of her sexual partners so they can be contacted and get treatment if necessary. Syphilis used to cause a large number of problems because once you got it, it tends to stick with you and it can cause severe deterioration in other tissues. It can travel up to the brain. It can destroy the soft tissues of the face, leading to people losing their noses and things like this. And it can also be transmitted through the placenta, so from mother to offspring. So a serious disease. Luckily, you can treat it with antibiotics. We're going to look at a related case history that doesn't seem related on the surface. So Fabrice, he's an 11-year-old boy in a village from the Democratic Republic of Congo. He's seen at a clinic. He has this cluster of lesions on his arm that you can see here. They're slightly raised. So the doctor's going to ask him, have you ever seen these before? And he remembers having them maybe one of these like 2 months ago, and it healed and he thought it was gone. They're going to do serological tests again, and now we find that he has a disease called secondary yaws caused by Treponema pallidum, subspecies Pertenue. This is closely related to the strain that causes syphilis. Pertenue, though, is transmitted by direct contact with a cut or a wound. It is very commonly seen in developing countries, particularly in tropical areas. The secondary part means that he had it once before, it healed, but then it returned because it was dormant. This is a really interesting set of case studies because pallidum subspecies and Pertenue subspecies can't be told apart by looking at them or looking at their metabolism or any of these things. The only way you can determine that is using antibody tests or sequencing their genome. But when we sequence their genome, we find they are super similar. There are only about 0.4% sequence differences between them, and these are deletions and repeats. There are no different plasmids. There are no major genes that are different between them. we don't understand what causes one to be a sexually transmitted infection and the other to be transmitted by direct contact with cuts. There were hypotheses in the past that it had to do with the climate and things like this that were leading to different genes being expressed, but we don't think that's the case. We don't know though, so this is still an active area of research, even for these very well-known diseases. There are some studies into which of these might have come first because they're evolutionarily related. Pertenue probably evolved first, and then pallidum is a derivation of that. Like I said, pallidum can infect fetus, whereas pertenue cannot. So why these differences? We don't know. Something in their genome, in that small bit of difference there. Okay, we're going to move on to one that is a little less disease prone, but very important to us. And then we'll go back to disease with the Chlamydiae. So Cyanobacteria and Chlamydiae are our last two groups here. The Cyanobacteria, as you know, they fix CO2, right? They gather CO2 from the atmosphere using sunlight through photosynthesis to create carbon-containing compounds. And in the process, they create a waste product called oxygen, which is very important for us. So they are oxygenic photoautotrophs. We need this oxygen to breathe. This is where all of the oxygen on Earth primarily came from. So they changed the atmosphere composition to be higher in oxygen with us. And we rely on them, right, as autotrophs to fix the carbon for us. They also do a lot of nitrogen fixation as well. Our final group, the Chlamydiae, is an interesting one. These are unique. Well, they're not unique, but they're known for being intracellular pathogens. They do not have a cell wall, actually. It's very, very reduced, very little peptidoglycan. We think this has been lost through evolution. So evolutionarily, they used to have a cell wall, but they have lost it because their life cycle involves being obligate parasites. That means they live inside of host cells. They can only survive in there. So Chlamydia trachomatis is one of the species that can lead to what's called pelvic inflammatory disease. This is a sexually transmitted disease as well. The bacteria, called elementary bodies, will trick their way into the cell, and once they're in there, they're taken up by endocytosis. They live in this little vacuole where they will actually reproduce and cause these reticulated bodies to develop, and then at some point they lyse the cell and release these elementary bodies, which then don't grow outside of the cell, but they will find a new cell to go in and infect again. And that infection can cause inflammation in the reproductive tract, particularly damaging in females. It can also, interestingly, cause the eye disease trachoma. So sometimes infected mothers can pass that on to newborns during the birthing process. So again, another one, luckily, that can be treated with antibiotics. All right, that is it for our survey of bacterial diversity. In the next chapter, we will look at eukaryotic microbial diversity.